Well, hopefully that explanation for the Electoral College wasn't too confusing. There's one more slide here I'd like to address just to wrap things up. There are three main themes to be addressed in this presentation. Initially, we'll discuss the first Constitution of the United States and some of its problems. Next, we'll explore some of the background of the Constitutional Convention, dealing with some of the problems that they were facing, as well as some of the important people who were there. Finally, the big takeaway is that there were many controversies, yet they were resolved through compromise at the Constitutional Convention. That'll kind of be the core of today's topic. So I'd like to begin by talking about the first Constitution of the United States and some of its problems. This map identifies the land included in the original 13 states and territories at the end of the American Revolution. Notice the area in pink on the right, the eastern seaboard. Well, those included the first 13 colonies that eventually became states. U.S. territory actually expanded all the way to the Mississippi River, as you see with the arrows and the second circle. In order to provide enough unity for those 13 colonies that were fighting to become states, they got together and they developed the first Constitution of the United States. The name of that Constitution was the Articles of Confederation. We'll explore some of the problems associated with the Articles next. While the Articles provided enough unity for the colonies to defeat the mighty British Empire, there were some problems associated with it. First of all, each state, when it came to passing legislation, had one vote, regardless of its size or its population. Let me show you on the next slide. Each individual state had a lot of power under the Articles. One state had one vote. So this meant that a large state like Virginia, with a population of about 750,000 people, had as much political power and clout, so to speak, as a state like Delaware, with only 60,000 people. Was this going to be a nation based upon the power of the people or the power of individual states? There were some apparent additional problems with the Articles. Secondly, there was neither an executive nor a judicial branch. Essentially, there was only one branch of government, the legislative branch, and there was a national Congress. Finally, states had a tremendous amount of power, as mentioned earlier. Some of the powers that they had was to coin their own money and even conduct their own foreign policy. States were allowed to levy taxes, but the national government did not. Well, let me try to explain in the next slide some issues with taxation. I don't know anyone who likes to pay taxes, but our tax dollars go toward a range of things. On the left, we see an image of George Washington at Valley Forge. During the Revolutionary War, one of the problems he continually faced was a lack of funding for things like uniforms, boots, things like that for his soldiers. On the right, we see some currency from the state of South Carolina. If you go to Europe, you use the euro. If you go to Mexico, they use pesos. In the United States, there were multiple currencies. There was South Carolina, New York, Pennsylvania. Each state had its own currency. It created chaos for business owners. Taken collectively, these range of problems with the Articles prompted some to want to try to modify those Articles or maybe even start from scratch. The fancy name for the meeting in order to get together to try to modify the Articles of Confederation is called the Constitutional Convention. Delegates met in 1787. I'll talk about that next. Do you know where they met for the Constitutional Convention? It was in the nation's largest city, Philadelphia. The name of the building was Independence Hall. It's shown here in the image. One of the things I'll point out would be the division among the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, but there was one philosophy or one idea that united all of them. They wanted to establish a republic. Here's a one-sentence textbook definition of a republic. It's when eligible citizens elect people or representatives who make decisions and establish policies for them. In the United States, we live in a type of a democracy. The type of democracy is a republic. There were 55 delegates from several states who attended meetings in Philadelphia. We're not going to talk about all of them, but I would like to highlight some of the important individuals who shaped the discussions at the Constitutional Convention. This painting represents some of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Some people have argued that the so-called greatest minds in American history were among the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Probably the most famous American among the American people is shown here. George Washington. He was the head of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War that defeated the mighty British Empire. One of the first decisions made by the delegates to the convention was to have Washington preside over their meetings each day as chair. The oldest delegate to the Constitutional Convention was over 80 years old. It was Ben Franklin. During the war, he had served as a diplomat and successfully was able to get the French to fight on behalf of the colonies. On the right, we see someone else. He was only 36 years old and is somewhat underrated as a political figure. His name was James Madison, a Virginia politician. If there were only 55 delegates, all of whom were white men, at the Constitutional Convention, there were plenty of people who were not there. However, I did want to point out one. He's shown here. Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wasn't even in the country during the Constitutional Convention. The individual who was recognized as the so-called father or author of the Constitution was James Madison. We'll explore some of the reasons why he's considered to have such an important role next. Next, we'll explore some of the controversies and how they were resolved through compromise at the Constitutional Convention. The first dealt with how each state would be represented in Congress. Madison's Virginia plan set the stage for one of the first controversies. Interestingly, though, the first two provisions of it were actually accepted by everyone. First of all, he called for the elimination of the Articles of Confederation. He said there were so many problems with the Articles, they had to start from scratch, and that was accepted. Secondly, he argued that the national government should be divided into three branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial. Here we see kind of a visual representation of this separation of powers. Madison argued that the legislative branch should be the most powerful of the three branches. While those first two proposals met with approval by the delegates to the convention, Madison's third main idea was very controversial. He argued that representation in the legislative branch should be determined entirely by each state's population. Here we can go back to that visual representation. Madison's idea here, to put it another way, is the number of representatives for each state would be determined entirely by each state's population. As you might suspect, the big states thought this was a good idea, but individuals from small states disagreed wholeheartedly. They would lose a lot of power under this new system. The success of the convention was threatened by the issue of how each state would be represented, bigger, small. Finally, cooler heads prevailed when the oldest delegate, Benjamin Franklin, developed a compromise, or at least support for what came to be known as the Great Compromise. It actually accepted much of Madison's Virginia plan, but it had a key distinction. It separated the legislative branch into two different chambers. The upper chamber would be the Senate, and every state would be treated equally. There would be 2 senators for each state. In the House of Representatives, the number would be determined by each state's population. This struck a balance between the big and the small states. The big states liked the makeup of the House of Representatives. The small states liked the Senate. Again, here we see that visual representation of separation of powers and the Great Compromise. The legislative branch was divided into the House and Senate. The number of representatives for each state was based entirely on a state's population, and this made people from the large states happy. I'd like to jump ahead to current events just a little bit. We have a census every 10 years, and these days, each member of Congress represents a district of about 700,000 people. Today, Michigan has 14 members of the House of Representatives. We're a fairly large state. Again, each state is treated equally in the United States Senate. Each state, whether it's in the North, the South, large or small, has 2 senators. The topic of slavery also divided delegates to the Constitutional Convention. The controversy dealing with slavery wasn't whether or not slavery should be protected in the Constitution, unfortunately. Instead, it was, well, how would they count slaves when determining each state's population? Here we are back at the original 13 states and territories. That red line indicates an area where south of that, slaves made up a large portion of the population because they played a crucial role in the South's economy. Slaves made up a large percentage of the population of many southern states. Representatives from those states would not even consider the elimination of slavery. But what they wanted to know was, well, how should we count slaves when determining each state's population? How to count slaves was important because it determined the number of members of the House of Representatives for each state. That's why this was so controversial. Rather than this being a disagreement between the big and the small states, instead, this issue of slavery divided northern and southern states. Once again, the future of the country and the future of the convention was threatened. The issue of slavery, too, was resolved by compromise. 55 of the so-called greatest minds in American history decided that when determining a state's population, one slave was equal to 3/5 of a person. Yeah, so-called greatest minds in American history. The issue of slavery would continue to divide the country until the Civil War of the 1860s. What was clear was that the delegates to the convention actually were embarrassed by their protection of slavery. The word slave does not appear in the Constitution. At one point, the word other persons, clearly referring to slaves, appears in the Constitution, as well as the phrase servant. Unfortunately, the Constitution actually justified and protected slavery. The last controversy I'd like to address dealt with electing the President of the United States, and it resulted in the creation of the Electoral College. There were lots of questions dealing with the chief executive. What should they call this person? How long should the length of term be? How many should there be? Should there be 2 presidents? Should there be 3? Should there just be 1? There were lots and lots of questions. Eventually, they decided to choose only 1 president, and that individual would be elected for 1 4-year term. But still, there were lots of questions about how to choose this individual. Some argued that the American people, or voters, should directly elect this president. Others said, no, it should be members of the House or the Senate. Eventually, they chose something unique. They decided to create something called the Electoral College. I'd like to talk next about how the Electoral College works. There are 2 key concepts I'd like to address when it comes to explaining how the Electoral College works. First, in order to win a presidential election, a candidate must win a majority of electoral votes. The magic number, so to speak, these days is 270. Well, how do we get this number of 270? Well, I'll try to show. First of all, we start with the number 435. That's the number of members of the House of Representatives. Then you add 100 because that's the total number of members of the Senate. Then you add 3 because Washington, D.C. is not a state, but it's treated like a state when it comes to a presidential election. The total number of electoral votes available is 538. A majority, or over half, of 538 is 270. So that's where we get the number of 270 electoral votes that a candidate needs in order to win the presidency. You might say, okay, I can memorize that. That's fine and dandy. But how does a person win electoral votes? Well, that's the second key concept. The candidate who wins the most popular votes in an individual state wins all of that state's pledged electoral votes. Let's think of it this way. Rather than having one election on a Tuesday in November every 4 years for president, essentially what we have are 51 elections, one in every state, plus Washington, D.C., because that's how those electoral votes are handed out. They're handed out on a state by state basis. Let's use Michigan as an example to try to explain this whole thing. First of all, let's look at the number of members of the House of Representatives for Michigan. Well, based upon the latest census, it's 14. Michigan also has 2 U.S. senators. That means Michigan has 16 electoral votes. No worries, do not memorize this chart, but I just wanted to point out how the number of electoral votes are distributed among different states. First of all, you see Alaska there. Alaska is a small state with only 3 electoral votes. California is the largest state with 55 electoral votes. It's the largest state in terms of population. Notice Florida. Based upon the different census results from 2000 and 2010, Florida's number of electoral votes went from 27 to 29. Finally, we see Michigan. Michigan used to have 17 electoral votes, but people tended to leave Michigan, and so Michigan today only has 16 electoral votes. Again, here we see some other comparisons on this distribution of electoral votes. New York used to be the largest state in the Union. Now it only has 29 electoral votes. Ohio used to be larger as well. It has 18 electoral votes. Now look at Texas. More people have been moving into Texas than any other state the last 20 years or so. Texas went from 34 to 38 electoral votes. Again, this is all based upon each state's population. Again, let's go back to that 2016 election in Michigan. Donald Trump was the Republican nominee, and Hillary Clinton won the Democratic nomination. Do you know which candidate won the popular vote in the state of Michigan? Well, it was Donald Trump. Donald Trump won the state of Michigan by a very slim margin. I think the smallest of any margin in any state. But since he won the popular vote, he received all 16 of Michigan's pledged electoral votes. With the Electoral College, it's all or nothing. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, how does a person get to be a member of the Electoral College? Well, first of all, any person who is eligible to vote can be an elector, as long as they don't already hold a national elected office. Like, you can't have a senator or you can't have a member of the House of Representatives as an elector. It's average people like you and me. The political parties choose the electors. Generally speaking, they're people who have volunteered for their party for many years. Maybe they've been a contributor financially. My former high school political science teacher was an elector one year. Lastly, electors are not bound to vote for the candidate who wins their state. But generally speaking, they almost always vote that way. If they don't vote that way, they're called a faithless elector. Now, you might be saying to yourself, why in the world would the framers of the Constitution allow for these so-called faithless electors? Well, it's a good question. First of all, though, the United States did not have a K-12 public education system when the Constitution was first written, and so, quite frankly, the framers didn't have much faith in your average American voter. because they believed that the American people might make the so-called wrong decision. They assumed that members of the Electoral College would be the elites in communities, and if the American people made the wrong decision, the electors would make the so-called correct decision. Here we see the national results from the 2016 presidential election. President Trump won a majority of electoral votes. He won over 300 electoral votes. But notice, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Out of about 128 million people who voted, there were about 3 million more popular votes, like people like you and me, who voted for Hillary Clinton. But let's explore this in a little bit more detail. Clinton won more popular votes, but as you see by this map, the red states indicate states won by Donald Trump, and the blue states indicate states won by Hillary Clinton. Notice there's an awful lot of red on this map. Donald Trump ran a very strategic campaign, and he knew how many states he had to win in order to win that election. And he won some states by very small margins, like Michigan, and Hillary Clinton won other states, like California, by very large margins. And so that's how one candidate was able to win the popular vote, yet the other candidate was able to win the electoral vote. When exploring other presidential elections, this has happened sometimes in the past. So, for example, in the year 2000, Al Gore received about 500,000 more popular votes by the American people than George W. Bush, yet George W. Bush clearly won over half of the electoral vote. This also happened in 1888. At that time, there were fewer states, so a majority of electoral votes was 206. Benjamin Harrison clearly won a majority with 233, yet Grover Cleveland won the popular vote. In the last decade or so, particularly since the 2016 election, there has been a movement to try to abolish the Electoral College. It will be very interesting to see if changes are made with the electoral system. Now, earlier in the lecture, I said, in order to win a presidential election, a candidate must win a majority of electoral votes. Well, what if there are a whole bunch of people who run for president and no one wins a majority? Well, the Constitution has a solution. The United States House of Representatives would pick the next president among the top 3 finishers in electoral votes. The House of Representatives has had to do this in the past. In 1824, there were 4 people who ran for the presidency. A majority of electoral votes at that time was 131. No one won 131 electoral votes, so the House of Representatives had to choose the next president. Well, hopefully that explanation wasn't too confusing. I did have a couple of concluding remarks. To sum up some of the key ideas from this lecture, first of all, the Articles of Confederation was the name of the first Constitution of the United States. You should also be able to identify some of the key individuals who shaped events at the Constitutional Convention. And finally, you should be able to explain 3 controversies from the convention itself and evaluate which you think was the most important. Well, that ends the first lecture for our class. I hope you learned something new, and we'll see you online. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.